Last week we talked about a best of both worlds boat with a shoulder aft keel, great for bombing around the Florida Keys or the ICW or the Great Loop or the Bahamas, but also making use of a centerboard to keep the upwind performance that you might need from time to time. One new comment that came in after the video was published that I found interesting that I didn't know. A Tartan owner explained that while most centerboard owners that they know do barely seem to make use of the drop down centerboard, they find on theirs that putting it down greatly improves the stability and the motion of the boat. It becomes more comfortable and sea kindly. And speaking of sea kindly and comfortable, we've talked in the past about the mighty full keel. These are ocean going, heavy monster cruising boats with a keel that usually starts just ahead of the mast and runs the entire length of the rest of the boat. They're usually big, fat, heavy keels, but relatively shallow, 5 feet usually at most. As we've talked about in the past on episodes about keels, the full keel delivers unrivaled comfort and the ability to withstand the weather and rough seas, but it lacks in a few places too. Everything's a trade off on the boat, as we all know. Compared to its fin keel opposite, the full keel tends to not point upwind very well, for one, and also due to the huge amount of wetted surface, they do tend to be kind of slow. They're also really hard to maneuver in tight quarters in the marina because the boat does not want to steer. There's a long keel almost the whole length of the boat. Turning gets kind of difficult. But on the best of both worlds front, is there a best of both worlds for these two? This week on Everything You Need to Know, we're talking about the full keel with a centerboard and one of the most famous uses of such a thing, the Pearson 35. We've been talking about these 1980s mid 30-foot cruisers a lot lately, and for good reason. Most people aim straight at these things for their first cruising boat because they're cheap, they're easy, you can find them everywhere, especially on the East Coast. And if you're shopping for just such a thing, Pearson is a name you probably already know. With an episode that we did previous about Pearson, which you can actually see right here, we talked about this, and here's a quick recap. Pearson was founded in 1956 by Everett and Clinton Pearson, and they went on making boats well into the 1980s. They made everything from racers to cruisers, and in my last season racing here at home, we do PHRF racing every Thursday and some Saturdays, our fleet of race boats was almost entirely dominated in 2021 by an extremely well-sailed Pearson 30. So these boats are no joke. And the legendary Carl Alberg, who also episode right here, that I definitely know and love, he helped Pearson out with some of the designs along the way, and some of the best designs that were ever put on paper. But it was William Shaw, another designer, that designed the boat we're talking about today. Now, while you're out shopping for that 1980s mid 30 footer for your first experience of island hopping in paradise or wherever it is you're going, there are a few key ingredients that you're probably looking for. First, always cheap. The price needs to be right. Spending anything over, let's say, 50 grand, for some people a little lower maybe, for me it was a little lower, just doesn't seem to make sense because you still don't know if the cruising life is for you, how it's going to work, and how long you'll actually be out doing it. So buying a cheaper boat and setting a smaller cruising plan, maybe a year at first, that seems to just make more sense. Second, you'll want something solid, obviously, something made by somebody you've heard of, with an excellent reputation. You may ask yourself, why reinvent the wheel? And I asked myself that too when I was boat shopping for my first cruising boat. Why don't I look at boats that people are already out there cruising on? They have a proven track record, and preferably they're already involved in a YouTube channel, so I can see the people that are already using it and what they think about it. Some sort of support system for said boat is going to be key as well. Like a solid internet or Facebook forum of owners who are happy to help and share their experience, and you could spend months reading through these forums before you even try to buy one of these boats. If a boat was only produced in small numbers, it just will not have the support behind it. Next is, the boat has to be able to keep you safe. A race boat is probably out of the question, so you'll want something heavy, overbuilt, keel stepped, skeg hung. Those things are important. Self-righting with tall coamings, good handholds. The ability to heave to in an emergency when the sea conditions go from good to terrible, which I promise you they will. Whether you prepare really well or not, you'll end up in some stuff and there's just no way to avoid it. So a boat that can deal with it, that's key. Now, if you're on the same wavelength as me so far, this is probably going to lead you to exactly where it led me. I'll take a full keel world cruiser that has actually, in documented, circumnavigated. And it has to have a good internet presence, whether it's a forum or a Facebook group or a YouTube channel that already uses that boat. A good presence. That way I can really get a feel for it before I go and start looking at them. For me, it landed me on Alberg, and most notably the Alberg 30 and the Alberg 37. A little bit the Alberg 35 as well. But what I consider to be Alberg's sister boat, or sister boats, in many cases, you'll also land on Pearson, and of course, the Pearson 35. The 35 is Pearson's sort of crack at, we're going to make a world cruiser aimed specifically at comfort and safety with a little pinch of being able to go fast. They built it from 1968 to 1982, specifically aimed at sort of the luxury cruising market, the luxury cruiser in the mid 30-foot range. And they put a lot of effort into making sure there was huge spaces on board for people to be comfortable. Just for example, the cockpit, the bench length, the cockpit length, 9.5 feet. 9.5 feet, even by today's standards, 9.5 feet is a huge amount of cockpit bench length, even for a 35-footer that they make now. Inside, you get a full width galley, wall to wall, port to starboard, full width galley. You get settees on each side. And of course, up ahead, you get the head and the V berth, typical stuff. Quite roomy, 6'5" headroom. Basically every boat from the era, but still very spacious and very livable. One thing of note that the Pearson actually has a double-decker bunk on the starboard side as you come down the companion stairs, which is sort of unique. You don't get that very much, but there's double-decker bunk, and that can be really useful if you have a guest on board, or if you're daring enough to go cruising with children. Bunk beds. What really sets the Pearson 35 apart from all the other slew of mid-30-footers made in that era was comfort, but not the comfort you might be thinking about right away. Comfort at sea. They could have given her a 6-foot fin keel high aspect, like a lot of the other boats were doing at the time. Think C&C and things like that. But they didn't. They could have done what Tartan did and done a shoal draft. It gets you in and out of the Florida Keys, through the Bahamas. Fantastic. Or they could have done what Lady K did on the Hughes 35, and they could have done a modified fin. And a modified fin is a bit longer fore and aft than a fin, but it's still shoal draft and very short, but it's also very fat and very heavy, so it's sort of the best of all three worlds. They didn't do that either. Instead, they did what any real Carl Alberg loving boat designer would do. They put on the biggest, fattest full-length keel that they could fit under that hull, in the name of capability at sea, in the name of safety, and in the name of comfort. Now, for all intents and purposes, the Pearson is almost indistinguishable inside the cabin, outside. Everything above the waterline is from the norm for her time and her price point and her size. But it's the underwater line features that really do change everything on this boat. We said before and earlier in this video that a full keel, it does have its ups and downs. It's a compromise like everything else on any sailboat. So a full keel has the weight and the tracking because of its length to plow through the worst the Caribbean has to offer short of a full-on hurricane. It not only keeps the boat straight, much more than any other keel would, but it keeps the massive amount of weight very low below the waterline, making the ride much more friendly and much more comfortable to anyone that might get seasick, or perhaps your spouse who isn't entirely sold on a sailboat because of the wishy-washiness of the ride. A full keel is going to be much better for those people. There were multiple times on my journeys where I wished I'd have gone with a full keel for those reasons. But the trade-off is the full keel has more wetted surface, and therefore it is slower. And notably, the full keel's hydrodynamics are nowhere near that of a fin keel, or even that, in my case, of a modified fin, so it will not point as well up into the wind. But another comment on YouTube said, "Are you really going to windward when you're out cruising? You will just stay in the anchorage for a few more days and wait for the wind to not be to windward, and you'll go on a beam or you'll go on a downwind." Um, but anyway, we're back to the best of both worlds. What if the full keel could point to windward? Lady K Sailing is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to keep this channel improving. I want to give a big shout out to this week's newest patron, Brian. Welcome, and thank you, sir. What Pearson did was sort of unconventional for the moment in which they did it. It was to fit a retractable centerboard inside the full keel. Under most circumstances, you can have the board upright when you don't need it, when you don't need the hydrodynamics to point higher. But when you do, you can lower the board. And much like Tartan that we talked about last week, the Pearson boasts just under 4 feet of draft when you have the board up, which is amazing for a monohull. 4 feet is incredible. You can be anchored with the catamarans within swimming distance from the beach. But with the board down, 7.5 feet of draft, of mostly hydrodynamically high aspect draft. 7.5 feet. To draw on personal experience, I will say there is a reason I personally did not buy an Alberg or a Pearson when I was in that buying market. I found the boats to be some of the most beautiful boats I'd ever seen. And of all of them that I looked at, the full keel gave me a lot of confidence and a lot of comfort. And these boats most certainly have, in a documented way, circumnavigated. And all of that is really good reason to buy one. What drew me away, however, was the 60s-ness of the design. And let me explain. A lot of things changed in the cruising boat design, cruising boat manufacturing between the 1960s and the 1980s. And the Pearson Alberg designs draw a lot from the 1960s sort of mentality of designing sailboats. And I did not find some of that attractive, most notably interior space. For whatever reason, and through all my research for the Pearson episode, the Alberg episode, this episode, the full keel episode, all these episodes we've talked about this boat, I've never been able to figure out why these boats tend to stick to a 10-foot beam. The only thing I've seen is that you can sort of get away with trailering a boat with a 10-foot beam down the highway. It's still not legal over 8 feet and however many inches based on where you live. But 10 feet usually is passable. Nobody really pulls you over. They're long and skinny, these boats. They have huge overhangs, and while that is very, very pretty, undoubtedly, the direct payment for that prettiness is in the cabin. 10 feet is narrow, very narrow. By the time the 80s rolled around, design seemed to reach a point where 11 feet was sort of the bare minimum. And many boats were well beyond 11 feet. Where you pay for it in a skinny boat is in the main cabin, and you really do just pay for it with comfort. I was in an Alberg and a Pearson recently, and the interior just feels cramped and a little bit squished somehow. Everything's a little bit smaller than you think it should be. It's like buying one of those houses in the subdivision that in the pictures looks like every other subdivision, except it's, 30 grand, 50 grand cheaper. And when you get into the house, you realize the proportions have all been sort of photocopied at 80%. Now, of course, I'm judging these boats by my more maybe up-to-date standards because 10 feet was the norm when Pearson drew out this boat. But over time and looking at many of these boats, and I was ready to write a check, I just couldn't do it. I can't stress enough that this is just a me thing, and some people adore these boats, and they have no issues with the width or the space of the interior. Just knowing what else is on the market, however, for relatively the same price, led me to keep shopping and ultimately buy something else. Something a little fatter in the midsection. So what's the verdict on the Pearson 35? In my mind, it's an extremely capable cruising boat. More capable than mine, for sure, and many others, with her full keel and her proven documented track record to be able to circumnavigate. The cockpit is massive and an awesome place to sprawl out while you're underway or entertain guests in the anchorage at the end of the day. She's overbuilt, and if I have to heave to, let's say on the Thorny Path, in 40 knots in a gale by myself the entire night in the dark, give me the Pearson all day long with her full keel. I'd rather be on that Pearson than a brand new Beneteau every single time. They always say, and this is sort of cruiser talk or sailor talk, the boat will always outperform the sailor when the worst happens. And this boat is one of the reasons they say that. But for every other experience or situation, I think I want something with a little bit more space on the inside for the money. As for the centerboard, I think I'm in the same boat as I was last week, pun intended. The added complication of a retractable centerboard, I just don't think I need it. There's too many moving parts. I get the point of it, but I don't need it. Would I take one of these things for 10 grand? Absolutely. 20? Yeah, probably. 30 to 50 grand? I'm going to start shopping around for a little bit more cabin space. I really am. That's it for this week, guys. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. That helps a lot on YouTube land algorithms and whatnot's witchcraft. If you want to see your boat featured, please leave it in the comments below. If you want to chat, find me on Facebook. I'll see you guys.